moderated by economic commentator Anatole Kaletsky.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming here. I'll start off by introducing the panel and then just say a few words to set the agenda. We have an absolutely perfectly balanced panel, both between Brexiteers and Remainers and between Britons and Europeans here. On my left, literally, we have Lord Peter Mandelson, founder and chairman of Global Council, but more importantly, a former EU commissioner, British cabinet minister, and the architect of the only election victories ever achieved in our lifetimes by anybody other than a conservative, if you think about it, the only times that a non-conservative government has been elected. Then we have Sir Michael Hintze, the founder and chief executive of CQS, an extremely successful London-based hedge fund, who has been an outspoken proponent of Brexit for several years. Michał Krupiński, CEO of Bank PKO, which I think is the biggest bank in Poland, is it? Yeah, and also a former minister in the Polish government and also European official. And finally, Peter Beyer, member of the CDU, the Conservative Party in the German Bundestag, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee of the German Parliament, and also now a minister for transatlantic affairs in the new coalition government just formed in Germany a few months ago. I will confine myself to just 3 minutes of introduction, and then I'll turn it over to the panel. But the question I wanted to address, just to set the agenda, is really why are we here at all, and why is it that the Milken conference has decided to devote one of the bigger rooms in this hotel to this subject, when, after all, most people here have been worrying about China, about India, Middle East, anything but Europe? Well, I think there are two obvious reasons and one less obvious. The obvious reason is that London is the biggest financial center, or the second biggest financial center in the world, and certainly the biggest center of international business outside the US. There is more trading done in dollar-yen in London than there is in New York and Tokyo put together. Secondly, Britain has been the gateway to the EU, the European market, which has, at least until Brexit, been the largest single market in the world. Those are the obvious reasons. The slightly less obvious reason is that Britain, over the last 25 years, and you may find this hard to believe, has actually been the most successful advanced major economy in the world. And here I'd just like to illustrate this with a few slides. If you'd show slide 23, please. If we look at GDP growth over the last 25 years since 1993, Britain has been way ahead of every other European country, as I think Michael is also going to say to us, lagging slightly behind the US. But the sole reason why the US has been ahead of Britain has been because of population growth. And a lot of people say, even in Britain, well, you know, the GDP growth has been because of large amounts of immigration, and that's boosted GDP. Yes, to some extent, but it's also boosted productivity and national income per head. And if we adjust it for population growth, this is the picture. Please show 24. In terms of national income per head, Britain has actually had the best rise in living standards of any G7 country over the last 25 years. But crucially, this has only been true since 1993. Now let's look at slide 25. In the period before 1974, before Britain joined the European Economic Community, as it was then, Britain was the sick man of Europe, was by any standards the worst performing economy in the advanced capitalist countries. Did joining the EC resolve that? Only in part. Please move on to slide 26. In the period between 1974 and 1992, Britain did perform better relative to the rest of the world, but it was only just in line with countries like France. Germany's not on this because of the complexities of national accounting in Germany because of reunification. It performed just in line with the rest of Europe, slightly behind Italy. It was only in the period since 1993 that Britain has had this spectacularly good, as I said, world-beating performance. And what happened in 1993, the crucial event, now correlation is not necessarily causation, but the crucial event was the creation of the single market, the European single market. People forget, if you just go back actually, just to illustrate that again, to slide 20, is it 24? Sorry about this, to slide 23. Sorry, 24, to slide 24, yeah, this is the one, slide 24. Sorry about this confusion, yeah. Usually it's nice to be able to control these things yourself with the clickers. People forget that the single market was actually a device invented by Margaret Thatcher to turn the European community, as it was then, into an economic entity that would serve Britain's natural comparative advantage, which was never in the export of manufactured goods, or agriculture, which is what the original European community was set up for, but was in the trade and export of service industries, which until the creation of the single market in January 1993 were really not covered by European free trade rules. It was because of this really rather uniquely British comparative advantage in service industries that the creation of the single market in 1993 had such a big impact. And this is where I'd like you just to illustrate that. Turn to slide 27, and then I'll end. Britain is really unique among the advanced economies in its dependence on service industries. And that is why the exit from the European Union and the single market is going to be such a dramatic and interesting event for the British economy and also as a model for the rest of the world. Having said that, what I'd now like to do is turn to each of the panelists and start off by asking them a very practical rather than ideological question. We can come back later to whether we think that Brexit is going to happen or isn't going to happen, what way it's going to happen, even whether it's a good or bad idea. What I'd like to ask each of you is what you think the impact will be on the practicalities of business, finance, in the case of Europe, the European project, if the British government achieves more or less what is its current strategy, which is to leave the European Union in March next year, have a transition period of 21 months until the end of 2020, in which nothing much will change, and then over that period negotiate a new relationship with Europe in which Britain is not in the single market, is not in the customs union, but does its best to create a friendly relationship with Europe. What will be the practical impact of that? I'll start with Peter and I'll go around.
Brexit is a process of trade deliberalization. It's not an act, it's not an event, it is a process of incremental deliberalization of our trade in goods and services. We, having spent the last 45 years embedding ourselves in what is the our home market, 500 million odd people of the European single market on our doorstep, and we have done everything we can to embed our exports, our goods, our services, to maximize our market share, to optimize our trading position in our largest home European market in order to grow, allow our businesses to grow big in Europe as a springboard in order to grow bigger and expand our market share in the rest of the world. And in the process, you've seen the statistics, you've seen the graph, we've had a huge lift, a huge boost in output, in productivity, and inward investment from many European, American, and of course famously Japanese manufacturers who have located in Britain to take advantage of all the elements of what I think is a superb business environment in Britain, better than anywhere else in Europe, but not simply to take advantage of our business environment and to get access to our UK market, but through Britain in order to have access directly without any barrier, any impediment, let or hindrance into the much, much bigger European market. And put simply, our decision to leave the European Union will result in that being reversed. Now, we will try to limit the damage, we will try to limit the extent to which we are excluded from the European market. And the European Union, the EU27, have indeed offered us a halfway house in which, having decided to leave the European Union, they are offering us a deal in which we remain nonetheless in the economic structures of the European Union. They're saying, okay, understand your vote, democratic will, your decision, you leave the EU, but you can remain in the single market with all the enforceable rights you have at the moment, and in the customs union, tariff-free, barrier-free access for your goods, if you want to avail yourselves of that halfway house, but the British government has rejected it. They have decided to come completely out, not just of the European Union, but its economic structures as well, its single market, its customs union, and then having once completely put themselves beyond the outer perimeter of the European Union to try and sort of tunnel their way back by means of a negotiation of a free trade agreement for goods. Whether or not, or the extent to which they are successful in putting in place such a free trade agreement, as I say, for goods, not for services, will determine the extent to which we're able to secure the continuity of our present trade in Europe. But one thing we do know is that it will be significantly and substantially less access with fewer rights than we have at the moment.
Well, and we'll come back to the question of what sort of New Deal they might negotiate. But, Michael, you obviously have a very different view about this.
Well, I'm not sure I have that massively different view. I mean, Peter is quite correct. I mean, this is non-trivial. You know, we've been together for 45 years to make these changes. Absolutely non-trivial. I mean, you know, it's a and to say I was a big proponent of Brexit. I mean, I definitely was a Brexiteer. But I mean, to say there was something which was taken easily from pure visceral points, a very different matter. But here's for me the point. Firstly, if you look at the goods point, and we'll come back to it in a second. If you look at our trade with, and I'm talking about UK trade in terms of services with with Europe, we have a surplus of £14 billion, £14 billion. The reality is, in goods, however, we have a £92 billion deficit with Europe. So, you know, I know Peter's saying there's been a wonderful situation, but after 45 years, the best we can do is to be a net deficit there. I'm beg to differ in a little way, notwithstanding the fact that there is an issue, and that's about £95 billion. But if I may call up slide 12, if I may. Okay. This, for me, is the issue. Look, to be very frank, on the way, this campaign that was there was, frankly, to my mind, on the exit campaign, was, frankly, the worst of politics. We had, on one side, we had what was known as Project Lies. On the other side, we had Project Fear. What we really need is Project Hope. And frankly, in my view, this is what hopefully the future will look like. You look at looking east, and frankly elsewhere, for us to be able to cut our own deals outside the customs union with China, with India, and others, and then others in the Commonwealth, is probably the way to go. Non-trivial, and Peter knows more about this than ever because he's, if you might mind saying so, when Peter was Trade Minister, he did a superb job for Britain. But the point is, this is where I think the future is, and we'll see. And if I might also just land one thing there, talking to my friends at the Bank of England, their view is in 7 to 10 years, it's not going to be a big deal whether we're in or out. But the point is that this is the opportunity going forward. But to be clear, this transition period of time, there will be winners and losers. It's non-trivial. It's not an easy thing. There's nothing that's easy about any of this.
Well, just before moving on to the European perspective, Michael, could I just follow that up? What is it about being in the EU that obstructs Britain's trade, prevents Britain from growing faster in its trade with India and China? Germany has both much higher volume and also far higher growth of trade with China and even India. Even Italy has more trade with China than with India. Than Britain does. So what is it about EU membership that would allow Britain to have faster growth in these more dynamic regions of the world if we were outside it?
Well, again, it's very difficult to actually put the real detail around that, but the point is it will allow Britain to cut deals one-on-one. Now, this is, again, a non-trivial way of doing it. I mean, at the moment, they can't do it. And the reality is that within the EU, you cannot have your separate deals. It must be done on an ongoing basis, and it's a matter of who is the trade minister now for the EU. Now, Peter was in that job, but the point is, it's what the differences are.
And you think that negotiating free trade deal? Yeah, sorry.
No,
Peter,
I'm not quite sure what the nature of the deals are.
Yeah.
Well, but Peter, I don't. Look, I'm a hedge fund manager. I don't know. But the nature of the deals would be in services, in goods, in trying to actually allow our market to be able to access their markets without any problem.
But the problem, and I spent 4.5 years of my life, and I have the scars, trying to beat down the trade policy barriers that prevent the West from trading better into China and to India. Their problem is that they have very clear border barriers, but tariffs, but much more importantly than that, they have behind the border non-tariff barriers, mainly of a regulatory kind, which purposely make it very more difficult than it should, given that they're WTO members, China and India, to enable British, American, French, German goods and services to be traded into those Chinese, Indian and Brazilian and other markets. I don't believe that those countries are going to remove those trade policy barriers simply for Britain, for two reasons. One, Britain is already a very open economy, so what would they be getting back in return? I mean, what trade policy barriers would we be removing in Britain to incentivize them to remove their trade policy barriers that protect their economy? I mean, there aren't that many because we're so open, apart from in agriculture. And secondly, if they open up to us, they're going to be placed under an immediate obligation to open up and apply the same opportunities and trade policy changes to everyone else in Europe and the United States and elsewhere. And they're not going to be prepared to do that until they choose to do so when it suits them at the time of their choosing in the manner of their choice. So I don't think Britain is really going to be in a position for the foreseeable future to magic away those trade policy barriers which we know infest China and India and other emerging economies, which we want to work with the United States and others in Europe to try to break down, but which we're not going to have the leverage or power to do by ourselves.
No, and Peter, you're 100% right. This is a non-trivial situation, but at the moment we are sitting...
Sounds catastrophic.
No, let me finish this for a second.
Let Michael finish.
Because the point is, we are now sitting behind a massive amount of trade barriers coming into us, especially in terms of agricultural goods. We can't trade freely with Australia, we can't trade freely with the Commonwealth, which I think is you would know that better than most, surely. You can't.
Well, let's carry. I mean, another argument you could make.
Amongst other places, but agriculture.
No, agriculture. Period. We've got open trade otherwise in goods and services with Australia and New Zealand, but they're very small percentages of overall trade as far as Britain is concerned. Even if you doubled and trebled or quadrupled trade with Australia, it would still be a tiny fraction of what we trade with the European Union.
Exactly, but we've got a massive, massive deficit to Europe in terms of our goods.
Well, let's come back to this issue. I mean, I think another argument you could make, Michael, along the same lines is that if we weren't in Europe, there would be a much stronger incentive for businesses simply to motivate themselves, even without government, without trade deals and so on, to go out to the rest of the world. And that's certainly something that Liam Fox, our trade minister, has been going around the country saying, you know, if we weren't in this kind of comfortable, cozy, but rather slow-moving club in Europe, maybe you businessmen would get out there and work a bit harder on selling your goods and services around the world. I don't know how realistic that is, but that is another argument along the same lines. How does this situation look from the European perspective? So we'll start with Michał. Let's assume that Theresa May more or less gets what she's trying to get. What effect will that have on the other countries in Europe and the structure of the EU?
Yeah, I'm afraid to say we don't know what she's trying to get. And I think the fact that, you know, there are, say, three phases or three aspects of Brexit from my perspective. First is the divorce. This already happened. Second is the transition. What we are seeing is a very protracted transition. When you look at GDP first quarter numbers in the United Kingdom, you see that, I'm saying from an economic perspective, the economy is in shock. You have weakness as regards households. Businesses are putting off investments. And my worry is, then there's obviously pressure on the Bank of England. My worry is once this becomes protracted, there will be even more uncertainty. And uncertainty is bad for business. The fact that we are here gathered in this room is because of uncertainty. We don't know what is going to happen. If the outcome was certain, we wouldn't probably be sitting here, and we would have another panel on Europe or some other regions in the world. So this is my first point, is that in fact we don't know what is going to happen. Second, there is a risk of the topic becoming even more politicized in the UK. We'll see what the outcome of the elections is going to be, and as you know, big division lines, and my worry is we will be watching political divisions and frictions for the next two years. I think third is, you know, coming back to first grade LSE economics book, of course, customs union is better for the UK, and of course, single market is better for the UK. And I think what is at risk right now is manufacturing jobs, you know, because UK, being part of the single market, is part of the global supply chain. If you get out of the single market and get out of the customs union, and by the way, I think it will be very difficult for the UK to negotiate deals with China and India without backing from Brussels. EU, as was stated in your introduction, is the largest trading bloc globally, and that's why it is so important to be part of it. And my worry is that manufacturing jobs are at risk. From our perspective, I would say Polish or Central Eastern European perspective, obviously our economies are growing. We are benefiting from Brexit in terms of jobs, so we did see banks relocating jobs, including to Warsaw with JP Morgan and Goldman's, partially because of Brexit. We as a bank, we also hired a number of people for key positions who have considerable experience in London. However, at the same time, my worry is less of economic nature, as long as we have global unprecedented growth. My worry is more of political situation in Brussels. The United Kingdom has always been a very big proponent of further liberalization in the EU, alongside CE. And what we are seeing right now is the camp of protectionist policies is starting to win the debate. You have, say, some of the French politicians who no longer talk about further liberalization of services. In fact, they blame Polish truck drivers on what is happening in France and some other countries in the world. So the dynamics in Brussels and the way you build coalition is starting to change. And I think this is a worrying sign, particularly when the water falls, and we will again be exposed as Europe to big productivity and social crises.
Well, that's very interesting, Peter. Maybe you could comment a bit further on that. Will Britain's departure, assuming it happens, and we're going to come back to that, will it change the balance of influence within the EU in any dramatic way from your point of view of Germany? And also perhaps you could comment a bit how it looks to German industry, this point about the supply change that Michał was making, because obviously German industry has a huge stake in the British market. Britain, I believe, is the second biggest market for German cars, car exports after the United States.
Oh, first of all, thank you very much for being on this panel. First of all, the Brexit issue is only one of the major challenges that the European Union currently faces, just this remark up front. But yes, definitely, I mean, it will have an effect by any means if we will see a Brexit, which is not for sure yet, and we don't know about which scenario is going to come out. You know, we are also preparing for a no deal scenario. We might talk about this a little bit later. But I want to shift maybe a little bit the discussion, you know, to the broader view. The discussion is a little bit one-dimensional. It would be one-dimensional if we only look to trade. Trade is very important, and we, on the continental side of Europe, certainly want a very close trade partnership with the UK, with the Brits, even after the Brexit, you know, is finalized. But there are other issues as well that puts, you know, some further challenge to the Brexit issue, which is beyond just pure business. One thing is internal and external security. Others are unsolved territorial issues. So if any proposed withdrawal agreement, you know, would have to, there's the issue, and it would have to be clarified. You know, where does it apply? What do we do with Gibraltar and the unsolved situation with Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, so the border issue? This is still something, there are big issues. Having said that, if you look to the, there has recently been, at the end of March, a European Council summit, where there is a big step forward in the Brexit negotiations. About 70 to 80% of the subject matters between the European Commission and the Theresa May's government has been agreed upon already. But these remaining 30 to 20% are really tough issues, and nobody knows right now how this is going to turn out. There are differences between the proposals and the opinions in Brussels and in London, and so this is something that needs to be solved first by the end of this year, and then in the transition phase until the end of 2020. One last remark, again, coming back to trade. I think it's going to be much, much more difficult, and by the way, will involve personnel capacities that probably the British government doesn't have if it now starts negotiating deals, free trade agreements with a number, with dozens of other countries, to have a situation where it has, you know, it might be similar to the situation the UK has now while being a member in the European Union. So this is something that they have to clarify for themselves. Within this transition phase, the UK, that is a proposal, can start negotiations for these FTAs with third country parties, but you know, it cannot, they could not enter into force while they are still not completely out, only with a consent of the European Union, or they can enter into force automatically then after the final Brexit, so to speak.
So let's turn it round then to, we've seen that there are a lot of obstacles and almost impossible impediments to certainly getting the rapid improvement or acceleration of trade with the rest of the world. And you know, as Michael, you also said, this is not going to be a simple or painless process. So maybe we should talk about what are some of the other scenarios that may unfold in the next year or next 6 months even, other than the one that the British government is planning for, which, as I said, is this so-called status quo transition, which nothing happens for 2 years, followed by an exit from both the customs union and single market. Maybe, Peter, as you're on the ground, you're in the House of Lords, you're voting on these very issues just last week. Maybe you could lay out for the people here briefly, what are the other options that may arise?
First of all, a quick postscript on trade. I mean, before we get on to negotiate trade agreements with China and India and Brazil and all these other easy to negotiate with countries, we have got to secure the trade agreements that we already have through the European Union. I mean, they cover, what, 54 plus countries. They represent about 85% of our trade. When we leave the European Union, we're not only leaving the EU and relinquishing our rights to trade in that vast market, we are then having to renegotiate and reconfirm, as it were, and secure all the trade agreements with other non-European countries, which at the moment are FTAs to which we subscribe through our membership of the EU. Those are not automatically transferable. They're not automatically grandfathered.
And this, by the way, is why the point about personnel that Peter Beyer made is a non-trivial issue. Just the manpower or woman power required to negotiate these things does not currently exist in the British government.
When I was European Trade Commissioner covering the world, I had a fleet of 700 brilliant officials. The British government in Whitehall, in terms of trade policy negotiating experience, you can count the numbers of people available literally on the fingers only of 2 hands.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
welcome to my world.
No,
I mean,
well,
you know,
I mean, sobering thoughts indeed. But I mean, Peter, look,
non-trivial.
No. But okay, I've said it. I've said it's non-trivial. But what would you do? I mean, you've been the thing.
I'll tell you what I'll do.
We are where we are. I tell you what you do. No, but let me get in the context. And I'd like to know what you would do when you've got the situation where Tony Blair is saying we should have a second referendum, we should stay in, but we must renegotiate the terms and conditions. We must reform the EU. We have a situation in you know, it's almost as if we're saying everything's hunky-dory in Europe. We've got a situation where there's many different things going on there. Anyway, do we really want to be in a situation where we have the Visegrad Four fighting with the rest? Where there's an east-west divide, where you have the north-south divide in terms of economics, where certain countries are trying to pull themselves apart. You've got that's also non-trivial. Now, your point is, tell me what you do aside from just throwing up your hands and saying it's all we're not to do nothing. And frankly, you're one of the smartest guys I've seen in this field, and I'd love to know what you're doing aside from just giving up and falling flat on your back and saying nothing more to do.
Well, Britain isn't a member of the Eurozone. So we don't have to sort out, we don't have a responsibility for intervening in and trying to resolve the issues of policy change and reform of the Eurozone. We should have strong views on that because they are the key to the future success of Europe's economic performance. So that's very, very important for Britain. But let's put the Eurozone aside for one moment, because we're not members of it. We never entered the single currency. Let's put aside the Visegrad countries, because there are issues in Central and Eastern Europe, but you know, we've got our own fish to fry in Britain, and we're going to have to sort out our own future. Now, why do I think we have not heard the last word on Brexit? It's because hitherto the real fundamental binary choices that Britain faces as a result of our decision to leave the European Union have never properly been spelled out to or introduced to the British people. We have continued since the referendum with the government to maintain the pretense, basically, that we can have our cake and eat it. that there is no real choice having decided to leave the European Union. We can both leave the European Union and continue to enjoy its benefits. It's like deciding to leave a club, tearing up your membership card, cancelling your subscription, and then thinking that you can beetle round through into the back door in order to continue to use the club facilities without your membership and without paying. This is not an option, Michael, and this is dawning. It has not yet fully dawned. It is dawning on the British public that we basically have, faced with a binary choice. We either, having left the European Union, continue to align our product standards, our regulatory structures.
Which we do globally, by the way. When we trade into the US, we do the same thing. Surely, it's not just into the EU. We have to align standards in everything we trade with, surely. You know this better than most.
No, you can't have different... You have a set of product standards. We don't produce...
What I think he's saying is that this is the choice that he's about to... Right. Either we stick with the EU standards, then we don't have the US standards, or we get out and do something else, but in that case we're not aligned with the EU, and you can't be a member of the EU club, right? Yep.
So let's sort of try and boil it down. We have essentially a choice between alignment and autonomy.
Yep.
Having left the European Union, or decided to do so, we can either continue to align our goods, product standards, technical requirements, and all the regulatory paraphernalia of our services with our largest export market by far, where around half our exports are traded and sold, and where incidentally we have supply and value chains in manufacturing that sort of crisscross back and forth between Britain and the rest of Europe as if we're building and manufacturing on one vast factory floor. And if we want to maintain that sort of our presence in that vast factory floor, then we have to operate and align with the same standards, etc. Or, if we don't want to do that, we can go for autonomy, complete trade policy autonomy, and we can decide we will change our standards, change our regulations in any way that we want, in which case we face major sacrifices in our ability to trade goods and services in the European market. And it's almost as binary as that. Hold on one moment.
Yeah,
what the British government is saying is, well, actually, we have made our choice. We're going for autonomy, not alignment.
Yeah.
Except in those respects and those goods where we want to remain aligned, but even in those, we want to retain the right subsequently to diverge. Now, I have, attempted to negotiate some trade agreements in my time. That is not a starting point for any trade policy negotiation I have seen anywhere in the world, period. And we're not going to invent it now. And the point I'm making is that when this comes home to the British people and to the British Parliament, which it will do sometime in the summer and autumn, I think we will not have heard the last word. I think when people actually see the stark realities of what all this means, they will start to think again.
Lord Mendelssohn, if I may just pick up on this last point that you...
well, actually, I wanted to turn it over to you, but Michael wanted to say something, but then I actually did want to ask you specifically
I will be very brief, Anatole. Look, I mean, what I don't understand, you've set up something which clearly is ludicrous and very difficult to go through, and you can paint that picture and then you can't deal with that picture. It's a great place to argue from, but let me talk about the practical point. When I sell my services, again, we in the money management business in the UK are a massive export industry. I comply with the standards in the US, not just in the UK, with Italy, which is different from the standards in Germany, which is different from the standards in Japan and Australia. We comply with every one of those standards because otherwise we can't go into that market. And the reality is, if you can do it in services, I'm not sure why he can't do it.
No, no, it's not services, it's hedge funds.
No, it's not hedge funds. No, wrong.
It's a very one-dimensional view that we're
You'll
using.
face a very difficult challenge if you're engaging in cross-border wholesale banking and asset management than hedge funds. Very difficult.
Well, yeah, although there are banks that manage to operate in Europe and Britain and America, a number of them
on
are
the basis
represented
of
here.
one regulatory system, European.
No, not necessarily true. Actually, I would say to you, it's not true. But there's not one system.
Okay.
Peter.
It does matter where you are.
With regard to the, well, now it's speculation, but I mentioned earlier as well, we also prepare, I know the German government prepares, and others as well, for a possible no deal, Brexit, but also if Brexit never happens. So that's why I wanted to pick up on Lord Mendelssohn's last point. Just want to toss the question to you, how realistic do you think? I mean, from a formal standpoint, in the end, but by the end of this year, probably, maybe even earlier, the British Parliament has to vote on the issue, finally.
On the deal that's brought back.
Exactly, on the deal. And so, I mean, if you can give us your opinion of the current situation, how is it there? This is one thing right now, so if we go through or not. The second thing that I wanted to add is, if you look to the negative sides already that come together with the situation we are now in, both in the UK and also in the rest of the European Union. You, Michael, were quite rightly talking about uncertainty in politics. It's a worst-case scenario that you can have there. And so it's already creating this uncertainty is already creating a lot of, as far as I see this, business loss. We see a lot of transition companies that have their European headquarters, or also subsidiaries in Great Britain, at least finding requests that want to know how is it if we move to the Netherlands, to Germany, or some other country. Some actually have done so already, the relocation to the continent, one thing. And from the beginning of this year on, starting with this Whitehall study out there, and there have been numerous others in this month and last month already, studies out there. We did some research, some prospect into the future, what would be the results on the business side, and also including the job market, both in the UK and in my country, in Germany, and in the rest of the European Union. Both come, not a single of these studies come out with as far as those studies that I know, say it's going to be going to have a positive effect whatsoever on the UK market, both job and business side. So in the end, I mean, they can only be losers in the end. And if you look to different sectors of the industries, in Germany, for example, depending on if it's car manufacturers or other sectors of the industry, there we will see some loss there as well, because we are trade partners, and there are challenges out there that need yet to be solved.
So, just before you answer that, Michał, you want to say, and then I think Peter and I might answer just the question about what is actually going on in Parliament and so on.
Yeah, I think there are people better positioned to answer a question on whether we can have a no Brexit. My view is, Britain is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, democracy in the world. Politicians are accountable, and a good example is the fact that you did have your Prime Minister resign after Brexit. I think Brexit is a pan-European problem. This is a Brussels problem. I haven't seen, by the way, anyone resign in Brussels because of Brexit. I'm a CEO of a bank. If I had a Brexit-like event with my bank, I would need to resign day one, before or right after market closing.
It shows us something wrong.
No,
with
so what
Europe
it shows is lack of accountability or not full accountability in Brussels. And I say this as a former official in Brussels. And by the way, I recall when I was applying for the job that the DG Trade people told me, I was right after studies, it's reserved for the British nationals. So when you look at probably with your staff, most of the people and directors generals were British. But I would also very much agree with Peter on the fact that you actually, even staying outside, you do need to adapt to what is going on. This reminds me of this debate in Switzerland, when they were always saying, like, should we join, should we not join, and they even, there's this word I think in German, souveräne Nachvollzug, which means even if you stay outside, you still need to adopt all of the acquis communautaire, etc. So there will be a big, I think, shock to some of the public in the UK, where you're losing the votes, you're losing influence, yet you are still member of a much bigger economic and political political organism.
So just before I pass it back to Peter to describe what you think will happen, I'll just fill the audience in, because on some events really that have occurred literally within the last 48 hours. Until last week, the position of the British government, or the position of the British government, is still that when Parliament votes on the final arrangement that the government proposes in October, it will have a binary choice: either accept the government's negotiated new relationship with Europe, or if that is not accepted, we leave the EU in March next year without any treaty at all, the so-called cliff edge scenario. What happened yesterday in the House of Lords was that an amendment was introduced to the Brexit legislation stating that when that final vote in Parliament happens, Parliament will be able to decide what the alternative is, and the implication being that if the government's proposals are voted down, if there's a majority for that, there will certainly be a majority to say that the alternative to the government's proposals is to stay in the EU rather than to crash out of the EU. And that's the parliamentary procedure. Now, of course, it's still got to be passed by the House of Commons, which is the dominant part of the legislature, and the government is going to try very hard to prevent that amendment sticking. But it looks as if it may prevail, and if it does, that would be the mechanism whereby Brexit might be stopped. That's just factual.
Well, there was also one other very important vote in the upper house of Parliament prior to that, and that was on the customs union, where the majority of over 100, including many Conservative Party peers, they voted essentially to say to the government that they wanted the Brexit negotiated on the basis of Britain remaining part of the customs union of the EU. And the purpose of that was to secure at least our tariff-free, customs-free goods trade with the European Union, even though it wouldn't cover services, which, as you know, are not supported by tariffs and other WTO rules. They're covered by different national regulatory approaches.
So, as an
different countries.
not an ex-politician, as a politician, what do you think is actually likely to happen to this legislation? And once you've answered that, we'll have 10 minutes for some questions from the floor.
I think with the resignation of the British Home Secretary in the last 24 hours, which is a great loss to the British government, but also a great addition to the backbenches in the House of Commons, because she's a strong pro-European. I think we are adding to those voices of departing ministers, because the two previous ministers who had to resign were also Remainers, and they will also use their voices and their votes, now freshly liberated from public office, in order to support, in my view, at least Britain's continued membership of the customs union from the backbenches in the House of Commons, and that will give cover for other Conservative MPs to support that against government policy.
Could I just mention defence?
Yep. And those of you who want to ask questions, start thinking about them now and after this.
Okay. Yep. Defence is something that we haven't talked about at all.
The what?
Defence.
Defence.
And I mean, the interesting thing about defence is that the reality is the UK provides 26% of the European budget for defence. It provides 40% of the R&D. It is something that is not in the debate at all. The reality is we'll see where all that goes. Britain is not somebody to leave their neighbours and friends behind, but the point is that at the moment, it seems to me, Peter, when all this negotiation is being done, nobody's talking about defence. Maybe it's valued at zero, but the reality is it's not valued at zero. It's a major part of NATO. It's it's an important part
But it's got one problem.
Say again?
There's one problem.
What's that? They don't care. Nobody cares. Where's the problem here?
Well, they care very, very deeply. The problem is that every single government analysis and projection, whether it be by the government or the Bank of England or the IMF, says we're going to have a smaller economy over the next 10 to 15 years.
That's not true. No, come on.
Okay,
No, Mark Carney, look, hold on. Mark Carney says it will not be small. It will not be small. It will not be smaller.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry too, you're right.
It won't be smaller. According to these analyses, it will be smaller than it otherwise would be.
I was literally just about to qualify myself by saying that we will have a smaller economy than we would otherwise have.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that will affect the volume of public spending. When push comes to shove, Michael, and I'm a politician, when there's a choice to be made between growing expenditure on health, education and schools, police or defence, I don't think defence is going to win.
Let's open it up. Let's open it up to the floor. Can we have a bit more light? There's a question here at the front, and then the lady there. Maybe we'll have two questions, and then we'll see.
Thank you very much. A great debate. One question I had is, do you believe if the deal is rejected, would there be scope for a second referendum? And do you believe there should be a second referendum on the basis that people did not know the full implications of the first vote?
I don't think that's the justification for holding a people's vote on the deal. I think the justification is that Parliament simply will not be able to reconcile its differences. There are too many cross-cutting divisions between and within the political parties, in my view, for Parliament to resolve this. And I think they'll, at the end of the day, have no alternative but to pass it back to the public.
Yeah, and I think, if I might add, it was really the first part of your question. Even apart from that, if Parliament does vote to stop the process, I think there would be a very strong sense in Parliament and the nation that that has to be ratified by a popular vote, because if you're overturning a popular vote, you need to have another popular vote to ratify that. I think that would be...
But would this be for still Theresa May's government or a new one? Would there be
well,
election?
Then...
And what's going to happen then?
Most likely not Theresa May's government, possibly a Conservative government.
It would be a Conservative government because we have now fixed-term parliaments. But the Prime Minister herself might fall in the process.
The lady there,
Seema Shah from Principal Global Investors. Actually relevant to that, I was going to ask that, well, one of the more disappointing things in the last year or so since the referendum has been that Jeremy Corbyn has been such a silent voice in the debates. Do you feel like the situation that UK is in now would have been so much better if we'd had more debate from the opposition?
Well,
I have a view on Jeremy.
Okay. Oh, well, great. Yes. We know what Peter's view is.
No. I mean,
he's sort of on your side, isn't he?
No. Come on. Come on. Let's hear Michael. Come on.
Please. He's definitely on neither our side.
Just before that, for those of you who don't, Jeremy Corbyn is the leader of the Labour Party, sometimes described as the Bernie Sanders of Britain, but that makes... in fact, Bernie Sanders seemed like a Thatcherite in comparison.
I mean,
but they're both populists.
Yes. No, stop here. There's a massive amount of anti-Semitism in the party.
Exactly.
There's a whole lot of horrible things going on there, and there's a lot of Stalinist, Trotskyism. I mean, it's a mad place. But let me explain why I think they're for it. Not because they think of anything aside from the fact they do. If inside the EU, they cannot nationalise anything. Once they're outside the EU and inside the customs union, they can nationalise to their heart's content. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're cynically for leaving.
Well, although bizarrely, that's not actually true. I mean, you can nationalise things in the EU as long as you offer compensation, which you'd have to do under English law anyway.
Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of my party, has as great a depth of understanding of these matters as he does across the policy waterfront.
I'm not sure the irony is entirely. I think you have to be more explicit than that.
Yeah. It's not a good thing to say about him.
He is not famous for his policy depth.
No, but the question, actually the really quite important substantive question was, would it have made a difference, and will it make a difference if the Labour Party took a real oppositional stance? Yes.
Unquestionably.
I would agree with Peter there.
Unquestionably. Yeah. I mean, it's just been a most appalling accident of history that the Labour Party should have had Jeremy Corbyn as its leader at this moment. For these reasons, he has no real policy understanding of what's involved. Secondly, he has a sort of throwback 1970s, 80s view that, Europe's about, growth and business and markets and things, and he doesn't really care for those things. And thirdly, he thinks that remaining in the European Union would stop him creating sort of socialism in one country. Actually, he's ultimately right. Being a member of the European Union does place policy constraints on you, but it doesn't mean that the state can't own all or part of industrial utilities.
Question there. And then after this question, maybe each of us can say a word for a minute summarizing.
I have to say I'm delighted to hear what I deem to be quite a hopeful perspective on what may transpire over the next 12 months. Two things that, for me, come to the forefront of my mind when thinking about that. First of all, what would you say the British public, and indeed the European public, would be able to expect and look for in terms of compensation for the utter circus that has followed Brexit, and therefore the waste of enormous amounts of tax money, if we do indeed end up saying, what were we thinking, this was ludicrous? That's the first thing I'd love to hear your guys' perspectives on. Secondly, as leaders of business or just general citizens of the EU or of UK, what can we be doing to ensure that we at least get a proper second look at this question at the right time?
Well, actually, that's a good general sort of question to give us each a minute or slightly under a minute to respond. Any aspect of that you want to say?
Look, I'd love the decision to be reversed. I think it's a possibility. I don't think it's a probability, but I think it is a possibility. And the more sort of chaos that unfolds in the course of the negotiation, the greater is the likelihood that first Parliament and then the public will want to look at it again. Obviously, the response of the British government to that will be to say, well, look, everything's not yet clear. I mean, let's leave the European Union first and then hold the sort of negotiation after and later. Let's get into the transition where the status quo applies, in effect, to disguise the implications of what it all means for Britain by postponing the consequences until 2020. And this is the argument that is going to be had over the summer and the autumn. But, in politics, I'm an organizer. In politics, always have been and will continue to be. But actually, in this case, something akin to force majeure is going to take place, one way or the other. I can't define it for you. I can't predict it precisely. I can't say when it's going to happen. But force majeure is either going to roll us up and bundle us out of the European Union completely on extremely suboptimal terms, or its force majeure is going to keep us in. I hope it's the latter, but it is by no means assured that it will be.
Michael?
Look, what is clear is that there's massive uncertainty. That's the only certainty we have, that we are massively uncertain in terms of where it is. And I think there is pain. But I am more optimistic than that. I am optimistic about the resilience of the technology we have inside and the markets, for that matter, to adjust. And the markets can adjust through currency, which fortunately we have our own, and we can go forward. But look, it is non-trivial, and I think there are a lot of things to come through.
Michał.
Yeah, so we had a very promising outlook here at different panels on what is happening on with, you know, BRICS economies and the US. So everyone is trying to solve 21st century problems and trying to benefit from fourth industrial revolution, whereas here we're trying to solve 19th century problems. Right? They're not even 20th century problems. So I think I agree with you. I very much fear we would have anti-reforms in Brussels and not real reforms and not further liberalization. And I also think that the attention of political leadership in Europe gets diverted to topics which are less of a relevance for the general public.
Peter?
Yeah, politicians are quite rightly accused of breaking promises that they're making during campaigns. I wish Cameron had broken his promise and not, you know, stick to his promise to make a referendum. I think we would not have this panel today. But having said, there's one final remark. I recently had a meeting with our former German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble. He's now the president of our parliament, and he said there will be no Brexit. That was his very brief and clear prospect. So again, there might be some hope. And from the panel, you see both the Brussels Commission, the EU Commission, Theresa May government, and a lot of national players are involved in this process. And you know, right now, guidelines and timelines are lying out there. But in the end, the parliaments decide.
Well, and my last word, the questioner asked, why isn't there, well, what kind of compensation will there be? Sadly, even in a welfare state like the European Union, there is no compensation scheme for political incompetence. All right, thank you very much.